Did you guys travel this year?
We're going to know the end of May, so we but it's
So they keeping you busy over there, Martin?
Yeah, good. It's fun. It's fun. Busy is good.
Off the streets and out of trouble.
Off the streets? I was never on the streets. But with 2 kids, you don't have time to be on the streets.
2 kids.
No.
2 kids and a Martin.
Yeah, 2 kids, especially one baby now and a first grader. No.
How old are they now?
7 and 1.5.
7 and 1.5.
Yeah, my daughter, there's 1.5 tomorrow. Alec is 7 and a half almost. They're born within 2 weeks. That's why I'm saying this. She's born 21st of July. He's born 7th of August. 8th of August. So.
and my dad will talk to me and we'll do this. I'm like, Dad, move your hand.
You got to figure out try to split the difference and celebrate the birthdays at once.
We celebrated the birthdays at once because the little one is a baby, so she doesn't care.
She doesn't care. But
Right now,
she will
she will care eventually.
She will care.
I actually bought a couple of them. I actually got one for something that I thought would really like.
How are you?
You said when you're from the south, because you say I'm moving.
That's a southern.
Yeah, well, it's dropping the G.
Yeah, that's you.
And on it.
Demo is not. Demo
I'm
is
gonna have to, I have to get down to the Board of Health.
4.
Put me in charge.
Yeah,
You know how to do it?
absolutely.
Hopefully.
How are you, Joe?
Julia.
I love that one.
Top one down.
How are you?
Thanks.
Who says right here though? It doesn't sound right anymore. I feel like I have friends in
10:30,
college.
my line off.
The Godwins.
The Godwins, the Gennaros. I think there's like maybe not even 1 degree separation.
I'll start to lose my voice as I do the other industry.
Today at lunch, and
How were you?
Yeah, well, I think it's all covered
Right,
except the hotel.
right,
So,
where they
you
use
know,
fees.
I got it for him for Peter Host and Rick Atherton and Tool Make Good Time.
It's actually a very nice group.
Yeah.
How's everything going?
Good. How are you?
So,
All right.
Yes. Catherine was here.
I've had several unrelated discussions about the growing diversity of our island and your
The 20-year snapshot.
yeah,
Something, isn't it?
it's amazing. It's probably the best resource I know of.
I know, it's really nice to look
It
at.
really
Wow,
just-
there it is.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at it so many different ways, as I'll say in a few minutes. But,
Now, somebody else.
hey, David. How's it going?
Eliminate.
Hi. How are you? I'm good. How about yourself? We figured, and this is your committee, but we figured most of you would want to look at the screen.
That's why we put that over here.
And so, but
You can
you're
move it
in
to-
charge,
you
and
want us to-
I won't say anything more.
Excuse me.
How you doing? Very good day. Thank you so much for the.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's
Is that you? That's okay. Let's see.
I get a dog at Nestle.
No, I have. Yes.
How are you?
And actually, I don't know.
I know the feeling.
Did write some motions.
117 pages.
I know.
I just looked at the scheduling.
Real work.
It's changed so much since I was back in the finance department.
Printed
Like
quite
14 meetings. So
Yeah,
I was
I just,
like,
yeah,
I just couldn't even contemplate that.
Saturday. We're gonna have
What they're going to do, we had one last year, so it's going to take some modification. We'll have a spreadsheet that'll come
Put everything
in one line.
That would be great.
use that better. If you come prepared ahead of me,
I've started working on it, even if you give up our Saturday.
Well, I would think you don't have to fight all the other committees for rules. On a Saturday. That would be easier.
Yes, it is all I get. Well, I'll move on. No. I'll move here.
Probably less if we come more prepared.
You changed the budget from the other night?
Yeah, no, it needs to be changed.
I couldn't find posting for your meeting with the budget.
They tried to post it and told them no because of the holiday. So they didn't make any,
Yes, and like the
so
previous
it
month
got
is
posted
holiday, so they
for the
count
next
they calculate
meeting.
on Friday, they do it on Thursday,
It was
so
kind of
it doesn't count.
they're getting it
It's hard.
It is hard.
Oh, jeez. You're all set, Mike?
Absolutely, I thought you were.
I call our meeting to order, please. Martin, we're going to begin. You can continue to hand out So our meeting's called to order. What's today, the 19th of January, 4 o'clock, Finance Committee. A reminder that we are both being videoed and probably streamed live as well as audio recording. So please, when you speak, if others in the audience are going to speak, step up to the microphone so that our viewers can hear everybody. Before we get underway with the school, we have some minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes? Any changes, deletions? Everybody's happy? Thank you. We're going to skip on committee reports, and we'll get into the school department. So delighted to have everybody here. And Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. And it would be great if you would introduce all your team.
Everybody?
Well, yeah,
Okay.
just so that we all sort of know, more out of curiosity, not to
Okay.
quiz them or anything. But,
Well, I have brought the whole team, as we do every year. That way, if you ask me a really tough question, I can look to them and they can come up with an answer. But with me here, I have Martin Anguilov, our Director of Finance, and Diane O'Neill, Director of Facilities. Among the three of us, we probably will do the bulk of the presentation today. But I have the three building principals, Kim Kubish, John Bucky in the corner, and next to him, Peter Cohen. I have curriculum coordinators, Michael Horton and Jean Witt, technology coordinator, Karen McGonigal, and let's see, way in the back, Jeremiah Splain, ELL director, John Lucchini, high school assistant principal, and then we have Caitlin Waddington, who is the community school director, and the Clemson rooter in the front row, Mr. Maury, athletic director. Well, given that I'm an Alabama fan, yeah, it's been a little tough, but I'm happy for him and for his team. So what we typically do, you have a lot of background pages on line items, but I'm not going to go over every line item, although we will take any specific questions that you might have. But I like to give sort of the 500-foot level picture of the budget. So any budget that we develop starts with enrollment. And you'll see with the first slide, just gives you an idea of what the enrollment for the last 5 years has been. And also the projected enrollment for next year. And one thing that I did with this, you'll see the zeros here because the new intermediate school hasn't gone online, but it will in September, and I wanted you to see how that number will break down next year. Right? So it's gone up slowly, consistently in the last few years, but you'll see from 12-13 to 13-14, we had a jump of almost 100 students in 1 year. So those numbers haven't stayed quite as high. And if, of course, you have any questions on any of these slides, I don't want to go too much into depth on them. The next slide, though, I think is interesting because it gives an over 20-year picture of Nantucket Public Schools. And for people who haven't seen this before, it's usually an eye-opener. You know, on one hand, we know the change in the demographics, but when you see it over a 20-year period, it is it's pretty significant. We've gone from 1,000 students to 1,588. All of these numbers are an October 1st number, which is what the state goes by. It's fun to sort of look at this, especially if you grew up in Nantucket and recognize your graduating class. It's kind of fun to look at the 12th grade and how it's gone from 43 to 112 this year over time. You can also, it's interesting to look across and see where your bubbles are in the district. We have a 134 in 3rd grade, and then you have the bubble here in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade with classes 145, 145, and 139, which are pretty amazing. You can also look diagonally and see what a class has done from 1 year to the next. I think I look at it and I see, okay, here's a bubble in the other direction. 84 in kindergarten this year. You know, we joke about job security with numbers, but we're happy to have the relief of a low number. It's a little bit easier when you have a few of those coming through because large spaces like cafeteria and library and whenever you put classes together. So it's just an interesting look, and of course, you know, this catches everybody's eye, the change in demographics from 95% to 60% white and from less than 1% to 25% Hispanic, and then also in African American, and we have a growing population of Eastern European that and even Asian. We have students from Nepal, the Philippines. It's really a pretty diverse population. I think, though, if you really look, the real shift has happened from about here down in the last 10 years. That's where, and you know, we try to show that provides us challenges, obvious challenges, but also opportunities that diversity brings. The next slide is another slide. This breaks out our ELL population. You will see terms used interchangeably. You'll see ELL, English language learners. You'll see ESOL, English speakers of other languages, and ESL. So I think they change it every year or two just to keep us on our toes. When you look at this slide, I want to point out that it's not year by year, because the first two are 2001-2, then 5-6. So don't think that we've gone from 15 to 115 in 1 year, if you follow those years. So that happened over some time, but pretty significant. We do project a little bit lower, and this next year, our numbers have sort of stabilized, and we're not getting the huge numbers that we did a few years ago, but that's a very hard number to project, obviously. Special education population is another way to look at the population. We have over 200 children in our schools who are identified as having special needs, and this is a range of services. We've broken out, again, the estimation, the projection for next year between NES and NIS. Every year we have between, 7 and 12 residential students. One of the disadvantages of being an island school is that we can't share in a collaborative day program that you might be able to if you were on the mainland and could send a child to a day program that is operated by another school district. So we've worked very hard to add programs in our district so that we don't have to send children, and we have limited those numbers, but sometimes there are simply children that we cannot serve in our schools. So you know what the budget was in 2017, and this shows the increase, which is a sizable increase. Those of you who were on FinCom last year, you may remember when Jim Kelly asked me if we needed more in last year's budget, and I joked that that was a softball I could probably hit. But we said no. We knew this year was coming, and this increase really is about opening a new school online, even though the numbers don't shift that much. And I'll show you where these additions come. This next slide shows the operating budget. Just over time, a steady increase. If you look at that in connection to the enrollment numbers, I think it makes sense. Enrollment sort of was fairly level or had decreased prior to 2010, and then I think we've added over 300 students in the last 8 years. The next slide, I think, is really important as well. It's one thing to look at the budget going up, but when you look at it based on a per pupil expenditure, I think it starts to make a little bit more sense. We've provided the state numbers, and you can see there's a steady increase in the state numbers up to almost 15,000 in 14-15. Those are the most current numbers that we have, in case you're wondering why we don't have 15-16. And you'll see that our numbers went up and then started going down over the last 4-year period, or the 4-year period in the middle there. That's directly related to the sharp increase in numbers of students. So your divisor is a lot higher. Okay. The other thing I would point out, though, is we as an island school district won't ever be at the state level. There are expenses of having an island school, such as residential placement, special education. On the mainland, you can go to an area vocational school. So your school district doesn't have to provide all the various vocational programs. Our athletic budget obviously would be significantly more because of the transportation, not only of our athletes, but of officials, and bringing them over to officiate games and paying the transportation on that. This number, I said to a group this morning, it depends on your point of view. If you're fiscally conservative, you're probably happy to see that come down a little bit and get closer to the state average. If you're a parent who's worried that we're not spending enough, you would say maybe that's not such a good thing. And I think we've done a pretty good job to sort of manage that. The next slide really is probably an hour lecture by Martin on how Chapter 70 is arrived at. It's a formula for the state for foundation aid. It typically goes up a little bit, and you can see that ours did. And then we had a sharp increase in, I think, the last 2 years. I'm not sure if the 16-17 is a projection still at this point.
It's a final number.
Final number.
Could you explain a little bit of an explanation of exactly what it is?
It's the state portion of the foundation budget. The foundation budget is the recommended amount of funds that the district should expend to provide adequate education. And it's comprised of two main components. One is the local contribution, which is the taxpayers fund that part, and the other part is the state aid, which is Chapter 70. So the characteristics that play into the foundation budgets are obviously enrollment and the amount of students in different grades, whether we have vocational students, special education students, because there's different amounts associated with these students. Also, it used to be low-income students were part of that formula. Now it's economically disadvantaged. So we're in the 5th decile. There's 10 different deciles, so we're at 39.50 per low-income students. Now, economically disadvantaged. I apologize. So that's what Chapter 70 is basically. It makes sure that every school district has enough funding. If they cannot provide from taxpayers' funds, that they have enough funding, the state complements that to reach at least to the foundation budget, the level to provide adequate education.
So when we look at your budget, is the $3 million
Comes into the
in your budget number, or is it additive to your budget?
This goes to town because we get more funding than the foundation budget that's recommended by the state. So this money are revenues to the town.
To the town.
Yes.
It goes into the general fund.
Yes.
So you can see it's doubled since 2013-14, which is advantageous. And
I also would like to point out it's at the minimum, regardless of how well the district might be doing or the area, town, municipality. It's supposed to be at least 17.50 of the percent of the foundation budget recommended as an amount. Ours is 19.6%, I believe, for this current year.
So just so I follow on, so your 2018 fiscal year budget of 27,486, which is coming out of the general fund, inflowing inbound from the state is $3 million.
Yes.
So the net taxpayer outlay is 27 minus the $3 million.
You can look at this.
yeah, I think you could, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
Do they take into consideration the fact that you talked about travel and you talked about we can't share resources and all those different things? I know they always look at us like we're a rich town.
Yeah, they don't. The percentages are supposed to be across the entire Commonwealth, and so while the amounts may change, they have the need to keep the percentages the same. Yeah. It is a frustration for us, not so much just in this, but in a lot of other things that we face, like when the Department of Ed requires professional development and then doesn't provide the person to come over here, or we end up paying transportation for something that is free from the Department of Education. And yeah. The next slide is our federal grants. These are monies that we get every year from federal and state. There are two kinds of grants. There are entitlement grants and competitive grants. These are what we would call entitlement grants. So as long as we write the grant to the specification that they dictate, we are automatically going to get our allotment of money. So you have different ones. The largest one you can see is IDEA. That's our special education grant, and that's been about that figure for the last few years. We use that to offset some salaries of special educators, and then some program development and sometimes a little professional development in there, or for specialists, whether it's psychologists to do evaluations and those sorts of things.
Michael, are most of these state sourced or federal sourced?
Well, they flow from federal to the state and then to us. Some of them, the state takes their cut before flowing it to the municipalities.
So is there any, kind of early, but tomorrow is tomorrow. Are there any concerns about some of these things being curtailed at the federal level under a new administration?
I can give you a couple of examples. There are Title I, II, and III, which have been coming. The Title I has been pretty much the same, and we use that for remedial reading. Pays for a salary and some other things to help children learn to read. Title II is for professional development. It has actually decreased a little bit for the last few years. Title III has increased. Title III is the funds are the funds that we get for ELL students. So as our population of ELL students has gone up, that's gone up, I would say, from around 18,000 a few years ago to 40,000. Title I, going back to that, it's for remedial reading, is based on a formula and factored in is how many free and reduced lunch students you have. So that's changed for us. That has increased. So sometimes your Title I will go slightly up based on that. But there used to be a title, to your question, there used to be a Title IV and a Title V that have gone away. Title IV, I'm on TV, so I don't want to be too critical, but Title IV is safe and drug-free schools money. That has gone away when the problem is growing. So I think that speaks. And then Title V was once called Innovative Schools, and there was a small amount that you could use, for that. So safe and drug-free schools used to fund our part-time student assistance program coordinator at the high school. So those funds flow in and out as long as you write the grant to their approval. Sometimes that is a little challenging because we'll write it and they'll say, nope, can't use it for that. And we'll rewrite it. That happened, I know, as Jeremiah worked on the ELL grant, and we wanted to do some things that we felt would support children and students, and they have some parameters around each of those. Just a quick slide showing you payroll salaries versus expenses. That's pretty typical of Commonwealth schools. I think you'll find most of them are 80% or above in salary. And the next one breaks it down by department or school.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Michael, on the expense side, does that include any debt service or related to debt service going forward?
I don't think so. I don't know.
No, does not include any debt service.
So the debt service is held outside the school budget, is that?
Debt service and health insurance are both held outside the school budget.
You have approximate numbers for both of those?
Off the top of my head, no.
It's because they're combined with all town employees. So we could get that for you, but The, by department, the one thing we haven't done here, we did not split NES into NES and then NIS. You know, it's a little bit hard to do at this point, and next year you'll see a different slide with that, but I would imagine you'd find them at about 15% each. Those are directly related to the numbers of students in our schools, in those particular schools. And then technology, facilities, central office, and athletics are percentages there. The next slide is a slide of the community school, and in red, or orange, depending on, this is the appropriation from the town every year. And then this is the amount that they raise in participant fees and donations and grants to help meet what the budget is in any year. You'll see, you know, the budget's increasing. Some of that is because programs are increasing. You may know that the community school has sort of taken over some of the recreational programs that the defunct recreation department. So they've added quite a few things, and this is the forecast for next year. This 465 is a little bit artificial. It's really 400,000 because the 65 is for a lease of the space that we use for the early childhood center when we needed to move it out of the schools for more room in the high school. Right? And that won't always be there. Next slide is special education residential tuitions. We have, as I said earlier, between 7 and 12 students in any one year going outside, you know, to the mainland for residential programs. They're very expensive. They range. One program might be $50,000 a year. Another program might be $200,000 a year. If you have a child that needs to go to Crotchet Mountain Rehab in New Hampshire, you can spend close to $200,000. Of course, they have multiple handicaps and needs, and need pretty intensive. This I like this slide because it shows you the first year I was here. This was our appropriation, or our budget. This was the amount that we got back from the state in a circuit breaker, and I'll explain circuit breaker in a minute. But we spent almost $1 million on residential tuitions. So because our appropriation and our circuit breaker did not equal what we had to spend, we had to find, you know, $300,000, $340,000 in the budget at the end of the year to make good on those residential payments. So I was obviously very concerned coming in new, and I said, all right, either we're not budgeting honestly, or we're not getting enough in circuit breaker. And Nancy Miller, our Director of Special Education, did a good job of being more aggressive with circuit breaker, but we also moved the appropriation to a point that was sort of like cheating at solitaire. And the problem was when you have to find $340,000 out of your budget that you hadn't planned on, you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul. You're taking money from another program. So over the next 2 years, we eliminated that budget differential piece. We were able to increase the circuit breaker, and even in 1 year decrease the appropriation. But as circuit breaker goes down in some years, then we need to bring the appropriation back up. our projection for next year is that circuit breaker will be down to $255,000. Just to give you quickly, a circuit breaker is a state reimbursement for to offset some of the costs of special education. It doesn't kick in until you've met the foundation level, which is about $50,000. So if you're paying $50,000 in a residential placement, you wouldn't get any circuit breaker. If you're paying $150,000, it does kick in. The problem is that circuit breaker is not always funded at the level that the state has said that they will fund it. And so sometimes if the revenues in the state are not good, they will say, sorry, everybody's going to get a little bit less in circuit breaker than you were planning on. So I hope it's can be pretty confusing, but I hope that helps you understand.
Clearly, you're anticipating less money.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, we know a year, it's projected ahead. So the year, we know that 255 is what we will have next year. What we don't always know, if you could go back, Martin, please. What we don't always know is what that final figure is going to be, because you could have a child move in that you hadn't budgeted for. You hadn't planned on it, and you own that child. So that can be a pretty significant hit on the budget. What the Commonwealth is going to do is something New Hampshire has done for years. They're going to allow you to build a stabilization fund so that if you get hit in a year, you could go to that stabilization fund. And so what we did in New Hampshire and what we hope we might be able to do here is if you have $50,000 unexpended at the end of the year in surplus, then you could put it into the stabilization fund. You'd like to build that up to, 150, 200,000, so that you have it there in a, if you get hit with a tough situation, somebody moving in that you didn't anticipate. So in developing the budget, the school committee gives the parameters to the superintendent, and then the superintendent meets with the administrative team to provide those parameters and talk about what our goals are. One of the things we need to do a better job of is funding line items accurately so that we don't have excessive transfers. You're always going to have transfers at the end of the year as funds become available, but if you're doing it in the beginning of the year, it's bad budgeting. So we have worked hard. Martin has met with each of the principals and department heads to look at, I think, 3 or 5 years history, so that we're minimizing that transfer issue. We wanted to obviously provide staffing for the new intermediate school, and I'll explain that further in the next slide. Reduce the counselor to student ratio at the elementary school level, and I'll show that in a minute. Continue support for ELL, maintain or decrease class sizes, and develop curriculum and assessment.
So at the end of the year, if
Systems.
you have extra money, which I thought you have the ability to move it around and spend it versus throw it back in the general fund.
We've given some back to the general fund in some years, but it's hard with a $27 million budget, especially with that residential tuition, because if you have a good year and you don't reach that million that you've budgeted, then you could have 200,000 pretty easily or quickly, just as much as you could have the 1.2, which would be over it. So that's why the stabilization fund, makes sense. So what did we do with this budget? We added custodial staff for the new school. There are 72,000 square feet in that school. And because I know you've been asked this question or have asked it yourselves, I'll give you an answer. when people say, why is it so big? It's actually smaller than the elementary school. It's 72,000 square feet. The elementary school is 87,000 square feet, but you don't see it because it's sprawling. And we had a tight site and we're building up. So maybe you could share that with the next person who said, talks about the size of the school. We know that we knew that we wanted to add a nurse in this budget, one for the intermediate school. Right now, the nurse is serving 720 children, which is crazy. We added a nurse last year for the middle school as well, separating. It used to be the middle and high were served by one nurse and a TA. And so next year, we're going to split this up, and you can see what the ratios will be. Instead of 1 to 720, it'll be 1 to 350. Guidance counselor, we have pretty good ratios in our schools, in the high school and the middle school, but not in the elementary school. The ratio in the elementary school is 2 to 720. The ratio in the high school is 3 to 525. And the ratio in the middle school is 2 to about 350. So this has been something that's long been necessary. Class sizes will be maintained. We're in pretty good shape in class sizes, with the exception of some classes at the high school. As that bubble that I showed you earlier, that wave, not a bubble, has come through the high school, we have some classes that have too many students, and John and I have, we've added some positions over the last 2 years to try to mitigate that, but that remains a concern. And then technology teacher, which we did not have at CPS. We had it in the budget, but we were not able to find a person to be in that position. We're going to keep that, and then there'll be assistant principals at each of the schools.
Michael?
Yep.
Quick question. What does the guidance counselor do in an elementary school?
All right, I won't do this justice, so Kim, you can help me, but they do a lot of individual counseling for individual children who have a range of needs, whether it's home problems or learning problems or peer problems. They do small group counseling, and they also do in-class, whole class. They'll work with a class on, respect or bullying or
appropriate behavior, or kindness with friends, or navigating a variety of social situations with friends. That's really important because the guidance work that happens at the elementary school is laying that character foundation that goes on.
And I just would say the obvious, children have more baggage than they did 20 years ago. They're coming to school with, and I don't want to paint everybody with too broad of a brush, but some of the kids that come to us really have a lot of challenges at home and in school. And
they also work with parents and families.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So the next slide is just to help you see the increases in the budget, but most of them are additions because of the new school. There are not any staffing additions to the high school or middle school, and other than the guidance counselor, not to the elementary school, because we had said to everybody, look, this is a big year as we bring these other things on board. One of the hard things to figure out is the increase in utilities for the new building. That's a WAG at this point, and we'll have to have a year or two of data to really be able to pin that down and make accurate projections.
Do we do any solar panels or anything like that for the new school?
We don't. They have taken a lot of steps to, we're not going to apply for LEED, but to meet the LEED standards. And the heating, Diane, is radiant heat.
We did not do air conditioning. We
Right.
did dehumidification system. We actually talked to the HTC about solar panels on the roof, and they said no, we could look into solar shingles for the roof. So we did a study, and the payback for the solar shingles was 23 years. And I can provide that information if you
Yeah, I
want
didn't
it.
know with the way the government was throwing money around with
Yeah.
solar and stuff, that we couldn't take advantage of that, or it wasn't available. Who knows?
Sorry.
No, thank you. I look to you for that. The other thing that we're hoping to do is, you see 13,000 for an electrician. We spend a lot of money every year contracting electrical work out in the schools. And so Diane came to me and said, this is crazy. I think by adding a little bit, we can use what we've used for contracted service and have our own in-house electrician. We'll see whether we are able to find that person. On one hand, electricians will look and say, I can make a lot more per hour out there. On the other side, you have benefits that factor in there. So it's something that we're hoping will work out to our advantage. And so that really is that piece. I think we're going to have Diane just take you quickly through capital, and if that's what you wanted.
Yeah, but before you go there.
Yeah.
Are there questions on the budget, please? I had a couple. Have you all looked at contracting for your custodial activities versus bringing permanent staff on?
Yeah, good question, and it's been asked. It's something that we can do again and look at. Right now, we are in a collective bargaining agreement with the custodians that takes us through 2018. So this would be the time to study, but it wouldn't be the time that we could jump into that because you would violate a labor contract. I think if it can be done, it would probably be with the night work, not the work during the day. And Diane and I have talked about it, and we're going to explore and talk to a few people to see how that might compare with our costs today.
But is it, are you saying that you can't do it until after the next agreement, or could you?
I think.
Could you hire a day shift worker and do, if it turned out to be financially advantageous?
I would need to look at and see whether we would be in violation of labor, and whether we would have an unfair labor practice. That I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly the first question that would have to be asked.
The other question I have, you might not know the answer to this, but it's sort of a broader, it may go to a broader sort of issue. When you all were looking at the new school and expansion, did you do a sort of a life cycle operating cost estimate of what it was going to take to operate the school in addition to just capital? And if you did, how accurate are you relative to what it looks like you're going to have to spend it to operate?
Yeah, I don't think we did a lifetime, but we did do some projections. I think that, again, we won't know until probably after a year of operation to see our actuals. you know, the heating system is gas.
All the other buildings are-
And so that's a change from the oil that fires the other buildings. We did the projections on custodial based on how much you can expect one custodian to do in so many hours, how many square feet can they cover. So we did some of that, if that's what you're referring
Yeah, I
to.
mean, it's a broader question because I think sometimes we leap into these buildings and just assume that the only cost that we've got is capital cost, and there's obviously a lot more costs
Yeah.
associated with it that sometimes is not brought out to the taxpayers.
Yeah, we did talk about it. I mean, it wasn't,
And I was much curious as to whether you were, if you did it, you know, how close you came, you know, because that's as instructive as actually going through and doing it.
right. I'll get into that.
Jim?
So Jim Kelly's not here. I'll pick up the mantle for him. Are we spending enough?
You know what? The town has been generous, certainly in the last few years, and this increase is helpful. If you ask most educators of that, we would say no. You know, we always see other needs. In the past, we couldn't get class sizes any lower at the elementary school, even if we had money for teachers, because we had no space. That's going to change in K through 8. It really, Steve, depends on who you ask. If you asked a kindergarten teacher, they'd say, no, we need an aide in every kindergarten classroom. And they're probably not wrong. That would be ideal. So that's something that comes to mind. If you asked a high school science teacher, they would say we need another science teacher because lab sciences should have fewer students in them than you might find in a regular classroom. Probably Mr. Maury could think of some things that we'd like to add, although we have added programs to athletics and, you know, technology. I think if you asked any of the department heads, they could come up with some things that we need. I think, given that we're opening a new school this year and the increases that come along with that, I think I would feel hard pressed to say, you know, we need more when the town and community is being generous.
So the reason I ask is I'm looking at the 2008 to 2015 per pupil's cost. The state average rose just about 20%, and we went down about 0.5% in that same time. Just in the last 3 years, we've seen the population of the high school, just the high school, where we didn't add any staff this year, or where you're proposing not to add any staff for next year. It's the population's risen from 490 to 541.
Yeah.
So those are stark numbers. I wonder what metric do you use to determine this is the appropriate level of staffing, this is the amount of money that we should be spending?
Most of that work is done at the building level. John Bucky will review the class load sheets, which is just, you know, they have a document that they'll print out for every class and every teacher and every period, so they can look at those numbers. This past year, we added a history teacher and a part-time PE teacher. And then the year before that, I think it was science, John, that we added. So over the last 3 years, as those numbers have gone up, we've added teachers, so I don't want you to think we haven't. It's just that this year was because of the other building opening, we said, you know, let's focus on this. However, our opportunity that doesn't always show up in the budget is when somebody retires. And if you lose a staff member at the heavy end of the salary scale and can replace them with somebody at a less costly, you could pick up $30,000. Now, you can't always do that, and recruiting on an island is tough, and recruiting in certain subject areas is very tough. Finding a math or science teacher, I wouldn't put the handcuffs on John and say you have to bring one in at $55,000. You have to have talent. So that is the opportunity sometimes that you say, okay, we've had a couple retirements, John or Peter or Kim, let's move forward with this thing that we didn't budget for, but now we're able to do. And we've done that, I think, as much as possible over the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay. So I hear you saying a few times that you're cognizant of the generosity of the community for the new building and new staffing for the new building. But what metric do you use to say that's all we need? Everybody else has what they need. This is okay for today. I mean, I realize I'm in a room full of educators and we don't like to use tests as a way to judge the performance of a school, but what metric do you use internally to say we're providing the community with what we want to provide?
I think we do look at test scores, but I think we also look first probably at class size. That would be the metric that drives, in the first decisions. And so if John is sitting there looking at 31 kids in an algebra class, that's a pretty quick metric to look at and say, whoa, I got to do something. But we've also looked at our math scores that aren't where we want them to be, and we've added a math intervention, 2 teachers at the elementary school level, 1 teacher at the middle school level. So test scores can, I don't want to say they drive that, but they are a metric that we look at as well. ELL is another example as the numbers increase. That's a pretty easy metric. You're doing it based on enrollment, but you're also looking at their proficiency level. If they are ELL students who are at proficiency level 3, 4, and 5, and it goes from a low of 1 to actually 6. But if they're 1 and 2, we know that we need more supports to help them be successful. If somebody is at a 3 or 4 or 5, they have a good chance of being successful in a regular classroom. But if they come in, particularly as some kids have in the last few years, to the high school without speaking English, how are they going to be successful in biology and some of those subject matters? When kids come in at age 5 and 6 and go through our system and graduate, those kids are being successful. They're being very successful because they're coming in at a point where they can acquire language. If they're coming in at age 15 and 16 without the English skills, that presents a lot greater challenge. And so I think that's a metric that the principals and Jeremiah look at and say, we've got to build more supports. We've gone from, and I'll stand corrected, but I think two ELL teachers at the elementary school to 5 over the time that I've been here. And from 1 at the middle school to 2, and from 1 at the high school to 2. So there are, the metrics would be, class size, but you also have to look at the at the performance metric as well.
So this budget, would you say that it's closer to a subsistence budget, or what you need to excel at all levels?
Great question. If you use the word that the state uses, is adequate. Mm-hmm. It's something that none of us particularly like. because adequate isn't good enough in this world. So we're not at a subsistence. We have a healthy budget and a lot of pieces, but I wouldn't say that we have a budget that allows us all of the individual attention that you would like every subgroup to get. We don't have a gifted and talented program at the middle school. For me, that would be one of the first pieces, because we've got to educate all children and make sure that they're not just in an identified group. So I don't know if I've skirted your question.
No, you haven't. You've answered it directly. Thank you.
Yep.
I had a question on ELL student. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just have a couple questions. Going back to the utilities, has National Grid come in and done like the energy assessment in all the buildings with the light bulbs and everything? Okay, and then I know the town, and this might be a question for you, has been working with National Grid about like doing an aggregate buy of energy, and they've come in, somebody's come in, like National Grid has come in and talked about that. Is that reflected in the budget or some sort of projection?
Well, I think there's two things. The town has a power agreement already. That's a power agreement. The municipal aggregation that you're talking about is actually for homeowners.
Not for government.
It's not for government because we already have a supply agreement that we procured separately through a separate power supply. So I don't want to speak for the school, but I'm going to assume that their budget number is based on the supply agreements that we currently have in place.
They are.
Okay. And then
And the square footage of the building, so.
And then over the next 3 to 5 years, like what's the forecast, right? Like what's in terms of, so this is sort of a follow-up question to what you were saying, is if this is where we are and there's this level, like what's the next challenge, right? We see, because you look at those grids and then you look at the population and the numbers, and in 3 to 5 years, what's the plan?
Boy, that's a tough question, and it is so driven by the numbers. If we could flatline with our numbers, then we can start to build programs. If the numbers keep going up, it's hard to do both with the dollars that are there. So in some years we've had to decide, okay, what's the prioritization? Are we going to address this or this? So not knowing what those numbers will be, and not knowing what the demographic might be as well, not just ethnic demographic, but socioeconomic demographic. I mean, there are so many demographics that people beyond the ELL. If we have immigration, where will that be? Eastern European? Will that be Asian? What is the next wave? And some of you who've lived on Nantucket a long time, at one point it was, Irish, and sort of has gone in through some different cycles and evolutions. And that factors in. So that's what makes the predictability maybe so hard. We did talk about this as we talked about the building program, because I think someday, under the next superintendent, you'll have to build another school. And what will that be? And how do we start acquiring contiguous land so that we can keep the campus that we have today? As I look at it, I would probably make the entire middle high school the high school and build a new middle school, because building a middle school is fewer dollars than building a high school. So we've talked about that, and we've talked about, actually, FinCom, last year or 2 years ago, put a figure in there to be able to buy properties if and when they open up. We don't want to go eminent domain. But if something opens up, this district needs to be able to pull the trigger on that so that, or we're going to be building a school, I don't know, in Sconset or,
But you're,
what's that?
you're funded to do something like that.
Well, we've started that, and so, we've identified certain properties, but we're not funded to do that yet. We've started that process.
And I think, we've sort of talked about it with the finance committee, in terms of like the new development that's coming online, and additional units of housing, how will the influx of, or potential influx of students impact the budget?
Great question, and of course, those projects have to do their analysis of the impact. I don't believe, they always give a range. I don't believe that the South Road project of 225 rentals and how many homes
94.
is going to provide 22 kids.
Neither do I.
And I've said that to the person making that presentation. And David has said that. We said that together, I think. So that, that scares me. And while we wanted to build the intermediate school large enough for growth, but not so large that you get the Taj Mahal label, that's a tricky thing to do. But if these, if the numbers, have I been worried that we didn't build it big enough? Yeah. As I see some of these developments being considered. Do we need more workforce housing? Yes. So I'm not against that. But I'm skeptical of the numbers and the impact on us.
But from like the budget and finance perspective, is there a contingency money? Is there money to study this problem? Is there money to look at solutions for this problem? Because this could happen quickly, and then how does it get addressed?
I think it would be, as odd as it sounds, coming on the heels of just the new school not even being online. I think it is something that needs to be moving forward in the planning stages, as long as we can do it without freaking people out, because it will, people will say, you just bought it, we just bought a new school for you and you're already, but this is the time to be putting together that master plan. Yeah. And that's obviously a joint town school thing. There are a lot of different things you could do. You could build a new vocational program and allow the high school to expand academic into the vocational way. And so there are a lot of different moves. I like the idea of using the present middle school and having a freshman academy on that side and building a new middle school. And of course, we do have, with the move to the intermediate school, we have built-in room to expand at the present elementary school. So.
Just to get back to the ELL students, we went from 4% expanded from 2005 to 25% last year. Maybe I got my information wrong, but I think there was a kindergarten class that showed up one year and there were 50 kids and they couldn't speak English.
Yeah.
But they were born in Nantucket.
Yeah.
So I think we talked about this, do we reach out to the community to maybe soften that and try and stop that?
Well, so a couple things. Some of that is, were there high numbers? Yes. Some of that is legend and that you hear, and all of a sudden 30 kids becomes 50%, and maybe it wasn't 50%, and not all of them just being born were ELL students. They may speak Spanish in their home environment, but many of them have some pretty strong English skills. So they may or may not have been identified as ELL students, which means they need help with English, but their ethnicity may be, the ethnicity may be 25%, but that's not 25% that needs ELL services.
So has it become, you said you've added from 2 to 5, are we getting, is it better, is it from this influx, do we have it more under control, or is it?
You know, it's, well, public schools can't put a no vacancy sign on the, you know, and so, I think kindergarten registration started last night. We had 55 registrants, and there might have been, I think, 17 Hispanic children in that. But it's way too early to characterize those numbers because you have another registration tonight, and then registration continues until the day school starts. But I do think that we believe that there will be a little bit of a slowdown in those numbers. It's such a variable. I mean, we lost over Christmas or right before Christmas, I think we lost 10 students. Maybe 7 of them were ELL students, and then 5 or 6 enrolled in January. And it's a very hard number to predict. But I think I can speak, Jeremiah, that we've seen it slow down a little bit. That's-
Just to add, just from knowing retail, which is the law in Massachusetts that prescribes how we service ELL students and how we identify them. In 2012, that was the year that they decided that everybody who was a kindergartner would be identified. At the time, they didn't necessarily have the appropriate assessments to identify whether kindergarten students did in fact have the literacy because they were, or didn't have the literacy because they weren't yet readers, or whether they didn't have the literacy because their primary language was not English. So it was tricky, and we've still been working and trying to figure out how to accurately assess early literacy skills, whether they're dependent on child development and whether they're dependent on second language acquisition. The other tricky piece too is, I believe Jeremiah last year, they mandated identification of pre-K. Identification of pre-K is mandated by the state, and so therefore we have to record it in SIMS data. It's the only assessment that we have is our home language survey. So if a child speaks another language other than English at all, or is exposed to another language, they need to be assessed for ELL status. Currently, there are no assessments for students at that level. Further complicated is most of our preschool students are coming to us because they are special needs students. So the language difficulties and figuring out whether it is because of their disability or because of their lack of English proficiency becomes even more and more difficult. So I think you're seeing an overinflation just among what you're hearing about that everybody or 50% of the students speak Spanish because of the way that they were identified, and we're still working on refining that. Not all of them are necessarily going to be ELL students, and I think in fact, district-wide, we're about 16% ELL and 25 or 26% of people who are non-native English speakers. So the first language that they learned was not English.
So I just had a couple of questions here to follow up. What is your average class size? I mean, I know you can't do it, or do you know it off the top of each?
Yeah, I have it right here. No, absolutely. I mean, if you looked at the, you can't really look at it this way, but I can tell you that in kindergarten, we have classes of 16, 17. In first grade, we have classes of 19, 20. In second grade, classes of 20. Third grade, probably 22, 23. So we really work hard to keep those primary grades in particular as low as you can. In the middle school, Peter, I think your class sizes probably range from 20 to 25, if you can, yeah. And then the high school is very hard to say because you have different subjects. So a teacher might have 15 in one class and 25 in another class. But and I can look through that and I can show it to you.
Yeah, I'd love to see the
Sure.
data. But so just to follow up on that, then using the 2016-2017 ELL, and I guess I'd also be interested, just as a side, to see the gradations of, like you said, there's a rate
Of the
of mistakes,
proficiencies.
yeah, so like who is, like how much of those 255 are the ones and how much are the sixes? I think that would help paint the picture, but just going off these class sizes, and then you saying you have only 6, or you went it from 1 to how many, 2 or 3 ELL teachers, or how many do you have total?
Oh, from 2 to 5
For-
at the elementary
at
school.
the elementary school.
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
like those, they're not in their own classes, are they? And there's not,
No,
or like how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's, first thing we can do is.
Because you see my point, because if
Yeah.
they were in their classes, they'd be huge.
Right. Jeremiah can send you his presentation, which
Yeah.
breaks the ELL numbers, or I can
Yeah.
send it to you, because that would give you the information that you want. Those children, these numbers reflect, the numbers that I just said, 16 or 17 or 19, reflect a mixture of ethnicity, of socioeconomic, of and of needs, and they work hard to try to balance those classrooms during the placement decisions, and sometimes you will have teachers push in to help. An ELL teacher will come into a first grade classroom, and sometimes you'll pull them out depending on what they can, effectively learn in a large group.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the ratio. You're saying, this is a place where you need help and you plan on increasing it, and if the ratio of the people that you have to deal with the issue versus what your normal ratio of teachers to students is pretty different.
Well, to give you an idea, though, if you're at a proficiency level of 1 or 2, which is the lowest in the language, you're going to have, you are get between 2 and 2.5 hours of ELL instruction. And if you're at a level 3, 4, and 5, it decreases the amount of specific instruction in ELL.
Push in, push out.
Yeah, exactly.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Diane, you want to give us a quick overview? Just so you know, we have done a review of all the capital projects for the town. These are part of our review. But why don't you just,
Sure. I am requesting, we are requesting $300,000 to pave the back of the middle and high school. That is not part of the paving that is going on with the larger project. If you've been back there recently, you'll appreciate that we put in for this. It's and there are some areas that are a bit of a mess. The next capital request is for school improvement. So normally, or in the past, I guess I should say, the capital requests have come in for specific schools. I run into issues with money left at the elementary school that I could use at the high school. Right now, the auditorium needs a new roof, the shingles are blowing off. We have a list of projects that we'd like to get done with this money. There are some carpet upgrades, a science lab in the high school needs to be upgraded. CPS needs some, locker work. There's some built-in cabinets at the elementary school that we need to replace. I think that the one that rises to the top for me is the dry sprinkler system to be installed in the server room. Right now, we have wet sprinklers. If the sprinkler system ever goes off, we're in serious trouble. And then there's some chain link fencing that needs to be replaced. We have a lot of chain link fence that was recently replaced with the new project, and there are some areas that did not get done. We'd like to do that. The next request is for Bacchus Lane playground and field improvements. Town meeting approved the land bank giving us that 5.4 acres of land that abuts our fields on Bacchus Lane. And I don't know if you want to speak to this.
Well, I'm just,
Mr. Kozowitz.
you know the area between the Mews and the existing fields. So the hope is that we will move the baseball field, which is now over here, in a terrible spot because it's, foul balls are landing on cars or into the school, and you have to, you watch the game by standing in the road, pretty much. So the hope is to move the baseball field over here, put playground equipment in here. I really think that it will maybe improve the area that is where some not so good things are going on presently, in the, behind the news. And so it'll be should be a good move, and it will allow us to separate our students into different playgrounds, and more specific for students in grades 3, 4, and 5. We have had approval at town meeting. It's been approved at the legislative level, which is something that has to take place, but the final agreement between the land bank and the town on which properties are going to switch hasn't taken place.
The last request is for the high school, middle school HVAC upgrade. We requested $300,000 last year to upgrade the elementary school, and I've been working with National Grid. They do have some programs in place. I actually was on the phone with them today about the elementary school. We have a new software system, obviously, at the new school. I'd really like for it all to be uniform, if that could happen. We also, there's a lot of motors, there's a lot of wiring that would need to be replaced with this project. And then the last thing is the land acquisition that the Finance Committee actually asked us to put on there 2 years ago?
Can I just ask a quick question? You mentioned technology earlier, which I guess is a capital, maybe a capital thing.
Sometimes.
Yeah, right. Is it possible to characterize the use of technology in the learning environment in the school relative to your peers, where we stand? Are we a 4 out of 10? Are we a 8 out of 10 in terms of how aggressive we are in terms of introducing new technology into the school?
I think, and I'll let Karen speak to this too, but I think certainly in the 7 years that I've been here, we've added a lot of technology. Interactive whiteboards in every classroom. I don't know how many we had 7 years ago, but it was probably a handful, and now you'll find them in every classroom, K through 12. The middle school has gone to one-to-one computing with Chromebooks, and the high school this year went to one-to-one computing in for grades 9 through 11, and then seniors bring their own device. I don't anticipate that we'll go one-to-one computing in the primary school. We will in the 3, 4, 5, but they won't be necessarily bringing them home. There's an interesting, I don't know if tension is the right word, but people are trying to get a handle on, okay, how much is too much and how much is a good thing. And that's something that you'll, as you read, the research, I think it's something that's coming into question more. I don't think it's technology that's bad. I think it's how it's being used. And we want to make sure that it is integrated and not for the sake of the device, but for the sake of engagement. And I think if used properly, you can engage. Our kids, like it or not, are in a much more visual mode of learning than I was when I went through school. It was sit and get. You sat and you listened and you made notes, and our kids are, visually stimulated, and learning visually at home, television, computers. So it's about finding the balance. I think, as getting back to your original question, on a scale of 1 to 10, compared to some other like districts, I'm going to throw out a 7. But Karen, I don't know if you would. Maybe an 8. If that helps you.
Thank you.
Question on this capital budget, how is this being financed? Is this free cash? This is obviously outside the 27 million, so where's
Free cash and the 1% capital expenditure requirement under the town code.
And just in general, I assume that there are other maintenance and sort of upkeep kind of costs that are in the regular budget.
Yes.
And these are just projects that you aggregated to up over the usual $50,000 cutoff for capital.
Yes.
Comes to the roof, could we outlaw 3-tab shingles on any building that we own? It's like I know they're cheaper, but it's like the stupidest thing ever invented, 3-tab shingle.
We went to architectural at the intermediate school.
Oh, you did?
At first, they put 3-tab on one side of one of the, and we said, time out, and because it was dictated actually by HDC, and we had to go back to HDC and said, look, this is just doesn't look the way that it needs to look.
You know, not even look, they just blow off.
Yeah.
Okay.
The auditorium has architecture.
All right, perfect.
Great, final question. Do you guys, do you think you're going to be done through your contract negotiations
Well,
by the end of?
Yeah, good question. We are, we're negotiating with the teachers. We have, we're in rolling 3-year agreements with the TAs, the educator supports, and the custodians. It's a process, David, and I always hope that we will get there, and we have in the 2 previous negotiations. This is a challenging one.
Okay. Any other questions? I think on behalf of the committee, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
For all the good job you do.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you, give me your email, I'll send you. Yeah. What year? Oh, great. Okay.
So all of these went through the capital review, so they had the opportunity with the capital. What's interesting about, thank you. What's interesting about the school budget?
Okay, so she came just on time.
We'll let Martin take care of it.
So this is just like the school committee. Recommends their budget.
You're going to stay and go through it more for David.
So we can approve the whole thing or none of it. We I mean, this is a huge chunk of art. Yeah, I would think that our budget review process would take twice.
Is everybody staying like this? So should I move over somewhere?
I bet if we wrapped it in, it'd probably be half the entire notes.
Can I sit here?
Please, just make sure you have a microphone. Well, it's interesting because I've looked at a few meetings that take place in history that this is a really tough thing to hear people, and it's really hard for people with their backs to the sound system unless you're using microphones.
made copies for everybody because
Jerry, I started.
Okay.
Well,
because it got sent so
We didn't
late.
miss any of the good stuff. I started about a minute and a half late.
Is this the, what you were talking about, what we were talking about?
It is online.
Yes.
That's it. You're welcome. And it's an absolute requirement for everyone to save ourselves from this. The fact that we let it lapse, I think, is terrible.